Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
I wish I could say I was surprised, but the truth is that when my mother put down her glass, squared her shoulders like she was about to make some grand announcement, and told me I was nothing but dead weight in this family. What I felt first wasn't shock or even embarrassment, it was this quiet click in my head like a lock finding its place. Because in that moment I knew the conversation I had been avoiding for years had finally arrived, and it was going to end very differently than anyone at that table expected, including me. I did not fire back, I did not cry, and I did not ask her to explain herself. Because there is a kind of fatigue that settles in after you spend years being useful in ways no one sees, and then you get publicly measured by a scale that ignores everything that actually kept the house standing. And the fatigue makes you calm in a way that scares people who are used to your compliance. So I just sat there with my fork in my hand and let her keep talking while my brother made a joke about me always being dramatic. My father stared at his plate like it might give him instructions, and my sister smiled that small smile she gets when someone else is the target and she can relax. It is funny, the stories people tell about you when they need a version of you that makes their choices feel right, because in my family's story I am the one who never quite launched, the one who shows up with advice no one asked for and opinions that complicate the evening. The one who never quite fits into the photo, and what no one mentions is the mortgage payment that clears on the first of every month from an account with my name on it, or the time the roof repair got delayed and I quietly called the contractor and put down the deposit, or the year my father's hours were cut, and I covered 3 months of payments so the letters would stop, because those details do not fit the narrative of me being a burden. And a burden is more convenient to manage than a witness. I could feel the old reflex tugging at me, the one that says keep the peace, explain yourself, list the things you do so they remember you are not dead weight. But I have finally learned that itemized self-worth is a trap, because once you start listing, they start moving the goalposts, and then you live your whole life waiting for someone else to stamp your value as valid. So I pushed that reflex away, and I told myself to breathe, to sit steady, and to let them hear the sound of their own certainty echoing back at them without my usual patchwork of explanations. My mother kept going, saying I bring tension into rooms, saying she is tired of my attitude, saying families work when everyone contributes and she is tired of carrying me. And it was almost funny in a grim way because the only reason the utilities were kept current this past year is that I set up a backup payment method on the account after 3 disconnection notices. And the only reason my sister kept her little business running after the car trouble in spring is that I lent her money for the repair and told her she didn't have to pay me back until she got through tax season, which she never did, and yet here I was being called the one who gets carried. I should probably own my part in creating this dynamic, because I made it easy, I made it secret, and I made it silent, and I told myself I was doing it to keep them safe, but there is a difference between protection and enabling. And I crossed that line a long time ago when I decided I would rather be resented for being present than blamed for leaving them alone with their choices, and I can see now how twisted that logic is and how comfortable it made everyone else. So I did the most uncharacteristic thing I could do at that table, which was nothing at all, and after the plates were cleared and the little arguments over who forgot the pie knife simmered down, I stood up, helped rinse dishes because I am not rude even when I am furious, and I listened to my mother tell my sister that some people just never grow up, and I felt something inside me stop trying to earn a place I had already paid for many times over. On the drive back to my old room for the night, I kept thinking about the word dead weight and how useful it was for them, because if I am dead weight then they do not have to see me as the scaffold that kept things upright, and if they do not have to see that, then they never have to say thank you or admit that the person they like to criticize is the same person who made it possible for them to relax at night. And I realized that my mistake wasn't invisibility, it was maintenance, because when you maintain a machine flawlessly, people start believing the machine runs itself. I put my bag on the chair, sat on the edge of the bed that still smells like old laundry detergent, opened my laptop, and signed in. And it was almost heartbreakingly easy to find the places where my name quietly shows up not as a beneficiary, but as a guarantor, a payer, an automatic transfer that no one even thinks about anymore. And I stared at those lines and thought about all the times I stayed up late worrying about due dates and penalties while everyone else assumed the lights would come on by magic, and I felt the kind of clarity that arrives when you finally decide the problem is not yours to solve anymore. I clicked into the mortgage portal first, because that was always the anchor, and I saw the confirmation of the next scheduled withdrawal from my account. And I sat there with my finger over the trackpad and gave myself a full minute to make sure this wasn't a tantrum in disguise, that this wasn't me trying to make a point, and once I knew it wasn't. Once I knew it was about balance and boundaries and a clean ledger between what I give and what they acknowledge, I turned off the automatic payment, removed my funding method, and saved the changes, and then I went to the utilities and did the same, one by one, calm, deliberate, no fireworks, no dramatic music, just a stack of quiet choices I should have made a long time ago. I am not naive. I know what happens when you change the rules after years of playing along. People call you cruel, they accuse you of overreacting, they tell stories about your selfishness, and the family group chat fills with concern for everything except the truth. But for once I decided I could live with their version, because their version was never going to include my reality anyway, and if they want to call me dead weight, then they can feel what it is like when the weight they never noticed is no longer holding the other side of the scale. Before I closed the laptop, I set up alerts on my account so nothing slips through by habit, and I drafted a single sentence in my notes, simple and almost boring, because I wanted to hear how it would sound out loud when I said it the next morning as I loaded my car, and it read exactly like this: I have canceled every payment I used to make on your mortgage and anything tied to it, and I will not be turning them back on. And I stared at that line until it felt like a fact rather than a threat, and then I put my phone face down, turned off the light, and let the quiet sit with me like a witness. And that is where I left it for the night, with the truth sitting on my screen like a sealed envelope and the first real boundary of my adult life finally drawn. Because tomorrow I would see what happens when a family that calls you dead weight realizes the weight they dismissed was the only thing keeping them from falling, and I am not sure if I am ready for the fallout. But I am absolutely ready for the silence that comes right after I say the sentence I just rehearsed. The morning after that little performance at the table, I woke up with that same quiet steadiness sitting in my chest, not righteous and not dramatic. Just steady, like someone who has finally decided to stop pretending she is the problem so that everyone else can keep their story intact. And before I even reached for coffee, I opened my notes and read the line I had written the night before. Because I wanted to start the day with a sentence that belonged to me, not to their version of me, and I let it settle there for a minute while the old reflex came back with its usual list of excuses about how maybe this was too harsh, or maybe they were just tired, or maybe I had misunderstood the tone. And then I reminded myself that fatigue does not produce a sentence like the one my mother used, and misunderstanding does not last for years. If you asked my family to describe the help I have given, they would say I am dramatic about the smallest things, but if you asked my bank statements, they would tell you more honest stories than my relatives ever will. Like the spring when my father missed 2 paychecks and the mortgage company started calling the house, and I remember standing in the hallway listening to him pretend the calls were for a survey while his shoulders slumped just a little. And I remember dialing the servicer from my car after dinner and setting up a temporary plan using my account because the late fees were piling up and my mother could not resist telling the neighbors that everything was fine. And I can still see the way my hands shook when I entered that first payment because I knew I had just walked into a role I would have trouble walking out of, and sure enough, the next month another payment was needed, and then another. And before I knew it, my name was the safety net nobody acknowledged and the dead weight everyone discussed. When my sister got the job she had been chasing, she needed a car that wouldn't die on the shoulder of the highway, and she needed it fast, and I was the only one with credit good enough to get a decent rate. So we found a modest used car, and I covered the gap between what she had saved and what the dealer demanded, and she promised to pay it back once her commission started rolling in, and every time I brought it up gently. She said she had a slow month, or the boss had changed the comp plan, or the taxes had eaten everything, and I let it slide because that is who I was in this family, the person who smoothed the edges, the person who understood, the person who did not need a thank you because this is what family does, which somehow always meant me doing it for them and never the other way around. There were medical bills the year my mother had that scare she still talks about like it was a triumph she achieved alone, and there were repairs after the storm that took off part of the gutter and somehow turned into a weekend lecture about how I never come home enough. And there were those little quiet emergencies that families pretend are normal, the ones where the lights get shut off for a few hours or the internet stops working and everyone sighs and blames the company until I step in and call and pay and take the blame for making a fuss when I ask why this keeps happening, and the pattern became so fixed that by the time I noticed it, it was not a pattern anymore, it was the air we breathed. So that morning I sat with all of it, not the shame they served me with the turkey, but the history they never bothered to touch, and I thought about why I kept paying even after they made it clear they preferred the version of me that could be dismissed. And I realized it was not loyalty or love or guilt, though all of that was in there somewhere. It was control dressed up as caretaking, because if I kept the plates spinning, then I did not have to watch them drop, and if the plates dropped, then I would have to admit that this family, as it exists in my mother's mind, cannot stand on its own without a scapegoat to insult and a daughter to quietly fund the illusion. I did not need more evidence to change course, but I wanted to do this with my eyes open, so I pulled every thread I had placed over the years and checked where it led, starting with the mortgage portal where my account had been set as a secondary payer with full access. Not because I asked for it, but because someone at the servicer thought it would be easier if the person who actually pays can see the statements, and then the utilities, where my backup card had become the default after two many last-minute scrambles, and the home insurance, where I had added my card one summer when my parents forgot to mail the check and then never removed it because it was convenient, and I could feel that old frustration rising with each login. Not because they used what I offered, but because they used it while telling me I was a weight they had to carry. I started with the practical pieces, because practical is my language and fairness is my religion, so I changed every password that had been created with my email and removed my account as a guarantor anywhere it appeared. And then I called the mortgage servicer, not to make a scene but to document the reality that I was no longer an authorized payer and that any automatic transfers tied to my accounts were revoked with immediate effect, and I asked them to confirm in writing, which they did. Because companies move when you ask them to in that firm tone I learned from collecting on other people's mistakes. Next I called the insurance carrier and removed my card as the billing method, and when the woman on the phone asked if I wanted to leave a backup in case of lapse I said no. The policyholder is responsible for the policy. And my voice sounded so even that I almost did not recognize it as mine, and then I closed the home repair line of credit I had opened after the storm years ago. The one that still had a zero balance, but a high limit that made everyone feel secure in a way that made me feel trapped, and I requested a confirmation letter for that too, which will probably surprise my mother when she opens the next envelope and realizes the easy option is gone. I know this sounds cold, and maybe parts of it are, but if you have ever been called a burden by the people who live comfortably on your invisible labor, you understand that this is not revenge in the cartoon sense. It is a recalibration. It is an audit with a heart, and yes, it is also a little bit of a thrill to realize I can rewrite the rules without yelling, without pleading, without giving another speech that gets laughed off as drama. By the time I finished, I had one last step that felt less like paperwork and more like a line in the sand, so I set fraud alerts on my credit to make sure no one could open anything under my name with a familiar address and a familiar last name. And then I drafted 3 short certified letters, one to the servicer, one to the insurance company, and one to my parents' mailbox, each one calm and factual and clear about what had changed and what would not be changing back, and when I sealed them, I felt something unclench in me that I have been carrying since I was a teenager learning how to balance other people's consequences. And, because every boundary in this family has to be spelled out before it is acknowledged, I did one more thing that felt tiny and enormous at once, which was to log into the shared email my mother uses for bills, remove my address from the forwarding list, and set a simple filter that moves anything with my name or my accounts into a folder she cannot see, not to hide anything, but to stop being the default pair of hands they reach for when a deadline is missed and a panic needs soothing, and when I closed the laptop, I realized I had finally taken my hands off the wheel of a car I never wanted to drive in the first place. I packed my bag and planned to keep my voice steady when I walked out to the driveway, because this wasn't about theatrics, it was about truth, and the truth was that I had built a soft landing for a family that used me as a mat. And today I had rolled the mat up and put it away, and as I zipped my suitcase my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number that made my stomach flip in that old, trained way, and I let it ring twice while I stared at the screen, and then I answered, and a calm voice from the mortgage company asked to confirm whether I intended to terminate the payment arrangement that had been in place for years, and I took a breath that tasted like freedom and said I did. I absolutely did. And the line went quiet for a beat long enough to feel like a verdict before the agent said she would note it on the account and inform the primary, and I thanked her and hung up knowing the real conversation was about to begin. Once the calls and cancellations were done and the confirmation sat in my inbox like small, steady anchors that kept me from drifting back into the old habit of fixing everything before anyone noticed it was broken, I realized that the real work now wasn't about toggles and payment methods, or even about money. It was about letting the silence do its job without rushing in to translate it for people who preferred not to listen unless the translation protected them from consequences, so I made myself a promise that for the next few days I would answer only what was asked, offer nothing that wasn't requested, and decline any invitation to explain my tone or my boundaries. Because it turns out the worst negotiator in a family system is the person who cares the most about keeping everyone comfortable. By late morning, the ripples started in the usual places, which is to say not with direct conversation, but with little pings that pretend to be neutral. My sister sending a casual message asking if I had seen anything weird with the internet because her streaming wasn't working and she had a client call she needed to prep for, which translated to the autopay she assumed was mine had finally failed and the grace period had ended, and I stared at the text for a full minute before replying that I didn't know and she might want to check the account on file, and her typing bubble came and went as if she was deciding how blunt to be, until she finally said she was sure it had been on a backup and maybe the company changed something. And I replied with a simple, "I'm sure you'll sort it out," which felt both mean and honest in the way a surgeon's cut is mean and honest at the same time. My brother waited until lunchtime to call, not because he is thoughtful but because he knows I am usually busy, and he can claim he tried if I don't pick up. And when I answered, he launched into a long story about a card issue that had to be a glitch because his minimum payment always went through, and I could hear the weight of that single word, always. How it was never an accident that his balance didn't grow and his utilities didn't shut off and his phone stayed on through months when he spent more on takeout than on his obligations, and I told him I had removed my payment methods from anything that wasn't mine, and that included the little arrangement that had kept his card in the safe zone. And he said I could have warned him, and I said I had warned myself for years, and apparently that didn't count either. And the silence that followed was a new kind between us, because in that pause he understood I wasn't bluffing. And I understood he had counted on me not to change. The afternoon brought a voicemail from a polite woman at the mortgage servicer confirming that notifications had been updated and the primary would receive a letter about the termination of the arrangement. And it was such a gentle phrase for what it actually meant, because what it meant is that the house that held 1,000 opinions about me now had to stand on the foundation my parents actually built instead of the scaffolding I had provided. And while I listened to her message, I thought about how many times I had asked myself whether I was cruel for even considering this, and then I remembered the sentence from dinner the night before and thought cruelty is not refusing to be used. And I felt that steadiness return like a pulse I could finally hear again. Mom did not call, not at first, because she prefers to route emotions through errands, which is why by mid-afternoon she asked me to run to the store for paper goods they had forgotten, a request that reads like help and functions like control. And I told her I was catching up on some work and wouldn't be able to, and when she said it was fine and she would ask my sister, the word ask landed wrong in my ear because it reminded me of all the times I had not been asked so much as assigned, which is part of how you become invisible even while everyone can see you, and I let the request pass me by without standing up to prove I was a good daughter who could be counted on at the last minute. There were small administrative things I had never done that I finally did, not to hurt anyone but to stop living as if the worst thing that could happen was someone calling me selfish. So I logged into the credit union and removed every shared alert that sent copies of my financial notifications to the family email under the old pretense of convenience. And I revoked the access that allowed anyone else to speak on my behalf to any company simply because we share a last name and a street, and I made a list of subscriptions and small recurring charges that had survived the first sweep, little kindnesses that were never acknowledged because they were never visible, and I canceled every last one of them. Then placed a small reminder on my calendar for a month from now to check again, because care without boundaries turns into resentment, and I am done feeding that animal. The group chat, which usually fills with recipes and recycled jokes, started to tilt toward me in the late afternoon. My sister sending a vague message about how certain people were making things more complicated than they needed to be, and maybe everyone could be a team player during the holidays. And the temptation to explain myself rose up like a reflex I could feel in my fingertips. So I put the phone down and let the message sit there without the usual patch, because a team where one person plays all the positions is not a team, it is a trap. By early evening, my father wandered into the kitchen with a stack of mail and a careful manner he uses when he knows my mother is simmering and he wants to calibrate before he commits. And he asked me in that roundabout way if I had heard anything from the mortgage people about some change notices that looked routine but felt urgent, and I told him directly that I had ended the payment arrangement I set up years ago when things were rough. And I watched him try to reconcile the kindness of that old decision with the firmness of this new one, and I even felt a pang that made me want to give him a soft out, but then I remembered he sat there last night and said nothing while she recast my life into a weight she carries, and I let the pang pass, which is its own kind of practice when you're used to swallowing whatever hurts in order to keep the peace. What surprised me most was how quickly the machine that is my family started to hunt for a new story, my sister spinning a version in which the servicer must have misfiled something and I was overreacting, my brother asking whether this was about some ancient gripe, my mother sending a message that combined concern and threat the way only she can, saying she hoped I wasn't doing something I would regret and that people who make impulsive choices during the holidays often ruin them for everyone. And I sat with that for a minute, recognizing the old choreography, and then typed a simple reply that said, I am not making an impulsive choice, I am making a final one. We can talk in the morning when I am loading my car. Which landed in the chat like a door closing slowly enough for everyone to hear the latch. Before I went to bed, I did one more thing that felt small to anyone else, but massive to me, which was to send my sister a brief transfer of the last bit she still owed me with a note that said paid in full. Because I wanted no scraps left dangling that could be used later as a leash, and then I marked our old agreement as settled in my own spreadsheet, a private ritual of closure that mattered more to me than any apology ever would. And when I finally turned off the lamp, I knew I had set the stage for the conversation that would end this era of my life, without shouting or pleading, only a straightforward truth delivered at a car trunk with the engine cooling and the driveway watching, and if I am honest, I could already hear the silence that would follow my line, the sudden quiet where their certainty used to be, and I knew that was the sound I had been working toward all day. By the time the holiday weekend drifted into that strange in-between where people pretend they are relaxed while quietly checking their phones for problems they hope someone else solved, the first real signs that the air had changed began to show up in ways so ordinary they would have been easy to ignore if I had not seen them 100 times before. Starting with my father shuffling a stack of envelopes he called routine while his eyes kept catching on the ones with red stripes, and my mother talking louder than necessary about leftovers while she waited for me to offer help that would erase the tension without anyone admitting what caused it, and my sister bouncing between breezy and brittle as she tried to decide whether charm or pressure would get her what she wanted faster, which in this case was the comfort of believing that nothing had truly shifted and that I would cave as soon as someone was inconvenienced. The day's first real wobble came from the utility that handles the power, which sent a text to the family phone number about a missed payment and a short grace window before a late fee would attach. And my mother clicked her tongue in that way that turns the inconvenience into a communal shame project, then announced that these companies hunt for money near the holidays because they know families are distracted, which is her favorite kind of story because it lets her be the victim of a faceless system instead of a person who ignored a bill she has the money to pay if she would stop waiting for the invisible safety net to materialize. And when she asked if I had seen anything weird on the account, I told her gently that I do not see their accounts anymore, which made her pause just long enough to register that the word anymore was doing more work than the rest of the sentence combined. My brother, suddenly concerned about everyone's stress level, offered to call the company and sort it out, except by sort it out he meant ask them to extend the deadline, stack a tiny fee on top of a bigger balance, and hope the next check would come before the next due date, which is how a family that thinks of itself as practical ends up paying interest on chaos year after year. And when he suggested they could put a temporary card on file just in case, he glanced at me like the old rhythm might repeat itself if he simply left a long enough silence after the suggestion, but I did not fill it, and the quiet rolled back to him like a mirror he did not want to look into. It is an odd thing to watch people realize that the story they tell about you has a real cost when the person they cast as trouble stops making their trouble go away. Because almost immediately the conversation shifted from utility drama to a broader lecture about how families pull together during the holidays, and how sad it is when people make decisions without thinking of others. And I could feel the baited hooks in each phrase, so I nodded once and said I agreed that families should pull together, which was both true and infuriating to the person who expected me to apologize for finally requiring that the pulling be done by everyone, not only by the one who has been labeled a burden for years. By early afternoon, my father opened one of the red-striped envelopes and found a letter with big words about delinquency and next steps and the kind of neutral warning language that sounds almost polite until you realize it is the last stop before consequences become expensive, and he cleared his throat and asked my mother if she had seen the mortgage email about changes to something called a payment arrangement, which she pretended not to understand as if terms are the problem rather than the choices that made the arrangement necessary in the first place. And then he turned to me and asked in that small, careful voice whether this was the thing I mentioned last night, the part about moving some payments around, and I said no, it is not about moving. It is about stopping, and I left the sentence there because every extra word becomes a rope someone will try to lasso around your ankles and drag you back to the place you just escaped. My sister tried a different angle, the one that always worked on me before, where she talks about how hard our parents worked and how everyone has their flaws and what good does it do to make a point that will only make people feel bad. And for a second the old guilt pricked at me because I do know how hard they worked, but then I remembered that work and accountability are not the same thing, and that I had been the one paying for other people's choices while being told I was the choice they regretted. So I told her softly that I was finished trading my stability for their comfort, and if they felt bad, that belonged to them, not to me. Sometime after that, my mother found me folding laundry in the room I grew up in because doing something repetitive keeps my hands steady when my mind is trying to replay old tapes. And she leaned on the doorframe with that mix of concern and command I have known my entire life, then asked if I had at least transferred the mortgage payment for the month, since it was due right after the holiday and sometimes banks delay things. And the way she phrased it told me everything I needed to know. Because she was not asking if I would help, she was asking if I had already done it without being asked, the way a self-cleaning oven is expected to operate without applause, and I set down the towel and told her that the arrangement was over, that I was no longer funding their home, and that it was time for the people who own it to take responsibility for it, and I watched the words, which were not loud or cruel, land like a plate on a hard counter, unbroken but impossible to ignore. She started to say something about timing and respect, how this was not the week to drop news like that, as if there is a week that is good for telling your parents that the life raft they took for granted is gone, and I said I had not dropped anything. I had stopped carrying something that was never mine, and her face did that careful rearranging it does when she is deciding which emotion will get her the best result, anger or hurt or dismissal, and she chose disappointment, which has always been her sharpest tool, but it did not bite this time because the person it used to pierce was not standing there, and I could see her realize that, and it made her angry in a way she could not show without losing the upper hand. The thing no one tells you about boundaries is that they sound aggressive to people who benefited from your lack of them. which is why by late afternoon my sister was sending long messages about legacy and togetherness, and how difficult it has been for our parents, and how sometimes a family is a little messy and you just have to keep showing up, and I responded once with a short note that said I had shown up for years, and that is why I am beyond lectures now, and then I muted the conversation. Because I wanted to walk into the evening without the buzz of old manipulations breaking my focus, and because I knew tomorrow morning would be the moment all of this crystallized into a sentence I had been rehearsing since the night my mother called me dead weight. When dinner rolled around, there was a stiffness to the politeness that anyone outside would have read as normal family dynamics, but I could hear the strain in the laughter and see the way my father kept glancing at the mail as if wills and wishes could change ink on a page. And when the dishes were done, I headed to my room and put my bag by the door so I would not have to pretend I was staying longer than I intended, and I checked my car keys twice, because that is what I do when I am ending something. Small rituals that keep me from second-guessing the next step, and I lay down and stared at the ceiling not for the drama of it, but because sometimes your body needs to feel a flat surface while your mind debt angles years of knots. And I decided I would say it in the driveway, not inside their walls, because truth delivers cleaner in the open space, where echoes cannot be mistaken for debate. I woke before everyone without an alarm because my chest carried one of its own, and I carried my bag out to the car quietly, not skulking or sneaking, just moving like someone who knows what she is doing and does not need a witness to prove it. And as I started arranging the suitcase and the small box of gifts I had brought, the back door clicked and my mother stepped onto the porch with her arms folded, casual in the way a person looks when they have spent the night choosing a tactic, and she called out in that bright voice that tries to make everything sound normal and asked whether I had remembered to transfer the mortgage payment before I left, because it would be so much easier if it cleared today, and I turned and nodded once. Feeling that steady line I wrote to myself days earlier sit on my tongue like a final truth, and I said we should talk now, and she took a step closer, and the quiet around us felt like a room waiting for a verdict I had already delivered to myself hours before. I did not plan a speech because speeches are for audiences, and I was done auditioning for a place in a family I had already paid for many times over. So when my mother stood there with that bright voice that always means there is a knife tucked behind the compliment and asked whether I had remembered to move the mortgage money, I looked at her the way you look at someone who has just asked you to hold up the ceiling again while they criticize your posture, and I told her, calmly and without any of the trembling that used to keep me up at night, that I had canceled every payment I used to make on their mortgage, the insurance tied to the house, the backstop card on the utilities, and the little transfers that patched holes no one ever admitted existed. And that none of it would be turned back on. Not today, and not next week, and not when the first letter arrives with language that pretends to be polite while it is really a countdown. For a second she did not react, which was almost stranger than anger, because silence from my mother is rare and expensive, and I could see her cycling through the options that usually work on me, the wounded tone, the outraged tone, the dismissive laugh. But none of them could land because I was standing in the driveway with my trunk open, my bag in the car, and the line already drawn, and when she finally said that families do not do this to each other, I told her gently that families also do. Not call a daughter dead weight while living on her invisible labor, and if we were going to measure what families do, we should start with what we have already done, not with what I refused to do this morning. She pivoted to concern the way people do when fury will not win, asking if I was okay, if I was taking care of myself. If I had maybe misheard her last night because she had been tired and the holidays were stressful and she was sure I knew she did not mean it the way it sounded. And I almost laughed because the effort to make the wound my overreaction was so familiar I could recite it from memory, but I did not laugh. I just told her this was not about a single sentence over turkey, it was about the story she preferred for years, the one where I am a problem to complain about and a solution to rely on, and that I was retiring from both roles as of right now. My father stepped outside then, quietly, like a man approaching a skittish animal. And he asked what was going on in a voice that told me my mother had not shared the part where I am no longer the automatic answer to problems she schedules around other people's convenience, and I looked at him and said I had ended the arrangement, all of it. and that the house would need to be paid for by the people whose names are on the deed. And he nodded in that slow way that means he understands more than he will say out loud, then asked if I could give them a month to adjust, and I told him I had already given them years, and this was the adjustment. My sister came out last with a cup and a face set for performance, telling me I was making a statement no one asked me to make, and that if I wanted to feel powerful there were better ways than threatening our parents' stability. And I told her there was nothing threatening about telling the truth, and that power is not the point, clarity is. And if she wanted stability, she could start by paying back even a fraction of what she still owed me before I decided to mark it as a gift so she could not pretend it was leverage later, which I had already done, and the look on her face when she realized there was no hook left in me was almost tender, because it showed me how much time we both lost playing roles we did not choose. There was a moment then that will stay with me longer than the insult that started all of this, which was the way my mother's mouth tightened and her eyes slid toward my father, as if she could cue him to take the scene back to the script, and when he did not. When he only said we would need to make some calls today and look at the budget, she realized the old choreography had failed, and she whispered that I would regret humiliating her like this, and I said I wasn't humiliating anyone, I was refusing to be humiliated anymore, and the difference matters even if she does not like it. I closed the trunk then because the conversation was done even if the noise kept going, and I told them I would not be blocking their numbers or disappearing. I would answer calls that were about connection and ignore anything that sounded like an invoice disguised as family, and that if they chose to sell the house or refinance or call the servicer to set up their own plan, I would not be their consultant. I would be their daughter, which used to be a role without duties in this home, and will be again if they want it to be, and I watched them try to decide whether to be offended or relieved. Because the truth is that freedom and responsibility arrive in the same envelope, and it is heavy to hold unless you are willing to stop pretending you do not see it. I wish I could tell you there was a tearful reconciliation, a sudden confession, a long overdue thank you that made the driveway glow with catharsis, but what happened was quieter and more real. Which is that my mother went back inside with her shoulders hard and her jaw tight. My father folded the mail and put it on the counter like a man who knows the next hour matters. And my sister sent me a message a few minutes later that said I was cold, and I said I was finally warm, because I had stopped standing in a draft that wasn't mine to fix, and then I turned on the car and let the air circulate while I sat there long enough to confirm that I felt steady rather than vindictive, because I do not want my life to be a reaction to theirs. I want it to be mine. Weeks later, after I let the dust settle and did not rush in to manage how they told the story to the extended family, I heard through my aunt that the house was listed and then under contract, and then that it had closed at a number that would let them start over smaller and cleaner if they wanted to. And there was a brief flurry of messages about the loss of tradition and the end of the big holiday dinners and how everything had changed because I could not be flexible, and I typed out 3 drafts of explanations and deleted all of them, because explanations are just invitations for people to debate your reality, and I decided I was done debating what I had already lived. Here is the part one did not expect. The space that opened in me once the payments ended did not fill with guilt or second-guessing the way I had been warned it would. It filled with time I used for myself without apology, and with a quiet pride that felt nothing like the showy revenge people imagine when they hear about a final move, because the truth is the most satisfying revenge I have ever executed did not look like a speech or a check cut with a flourish. It looked like a closed browser tab, a canceled autopay, a trunk shutting on a suitcase that belonged to me, and a sentence delivered without anger that rearranged the whole map of what was possible between us. Every now and then my mother calls and tests the edges, dropping a line about how hard it is to keep up with everything these days and how families should remember their commitments, and I listen and change the subject and ask about her day. And sometimes she grumbles and sometimes she laughs, and neither response is my problem anymore, because the final answer was given in that driveway when I told her the payments were canceled, and I did not flinch, and if there is any lingering conflict, it lives on their side of the line, not mine, and I can live with that. I can live with the unfinished edges, because the core truth is complete. I was never dead weight. I was the beam, and I decided to stop holding up a roof that kept me in the dark. And if that sounds harsh to anyone listening, they can call it harsh. I call it honest. I call it earned. And I call it the first holiday of my adult life that ended with me driving away without carrying what does not belong to me.